Today we're going to continue our lesson on using division of fractions, multiplying decimals, and dividing decimals in real-world situations. So our first example here today, a school district buys 96 packages of highlighters. 3/8 of the packages go to the English department and the rest to the math department. The math department gives 2/3 of each package to each math teacher working in the school district. How many math teachers will receive highlighters? So one problem-solving method that we could use to help us here is to draw a picture. And the picture we draw is going to be based off of our first fraction that's listed of 3/8. So since it says 3/8 of the packages, I'm going to draw 8 boxes, and the 8 is based on the denominator of that fraction. And since 3/8 of the packages go to the English department, I'll label 3 of them with an E, that stands for English, and the rest go to the math department. So these remaining boxes are going to the math department. Well, since we started with 96 highlighters, to figure out how many go to the math department, we know that 5/8 of the marker of the highlighters go to the math department. So to figure out how many that actually is, we take 96 times 5/8. And so we can divide both 8 and 96 by 8. 8 becomes 1, 96 becomes 12. 12 times 5 is 60. So we have 60 packages going to the math department. And then the math department gives 2/3 of each package. So what it's doing, it's breaking apart those 60 packages. So to figure out how many teachers will receive highlighters, we take the number of highlighters, packages of highlighters, and divide it by the 2/3. And so we would keep the first number, change division to multiplication, use the reciprocal of 2/3, which is 3/2. Divide both 60 and 2 by 2. 2 becomes 1. 60 becomes 30. 30 times 3 is 90. And so that would be 90 teachers or 90 math teachers. So in our next problem here, Andrea buys 75 cups of excuse me, of cranberry apple juice for a party. She uses 2/5 of the juice to make punch. She then uses the remaining juice to pour single servings that are 5/6 of a cup each. How many single servings does Andrea pour? So very similar to the previous question that we just answered. So I'm going to start by drawing a picture. And again, I base that picture off of the denominator of my initial fraction. And so since my fraction is 2/5, I'm going to draw 5 circles this time. You can do boxes, you can do circles, you can do stick figures, whatever you want to use. So 2/5 of the juice goes to make punch. So those 2 are for the punch, which means the rest are those single servings. So in the previous question, I had 96 highlighters. In this question, I have 75 cups of cranberry apple juice. I had 3/8 of the markers going to the English department. Here I have 2/5 of the juice making punch. And in the previous problem, I found that 5/8 went to the math department because there's 5 remaining boxes. So in this situation, we're going to have 3/5 going for those single servings because we have 3 circles here that are left. So in the previous problem, I did 96 times 5/8 to figure out how many actual packages of highlighters there were. Well, I don't have 96 this time, I have 75. And I don't have 5/8, I have 3/5. So I just swap out my numbers there and I follow the same steps. I can divide both 75 and 5 by 5. 5 becomes 1. 75 becomes 15. 15 times 3 is 45. Well, in the previous problem, I didn't have 45, I had 60. I didn't have 5/6 of a cup, I had 2/3. On the previous problem, I took 60 divided by 2/3. So for this one, I'm going to take 45 and divide it by 5/6 to figure out how many single servings Andrea pours. So I'll keep 45 the same, change division multiplication, and use my reciprocal. I can divide both 5 and 45 by 5. 5 becomes 1. 45 becomes 9. 9 times 6 is 54. And that would be 54 servings. Now you could, of course, label it single servings, but that is kind of redundant. Our next example here, we are going to have to do some rounding. So we have to decide whether we round up or round down based on the situation. So Kathy has 9 sticks of modeling clay. She cuts the sticks into thirds and shares the pieces equally with some children. Each child gets 2/3 of a stick. Now, one assumption we make is that she gives out all of the clay. So any question like this, we're assuming that you're giving out as much as you can. So we want to figure out how many children there are altogether. So in order to find out how many children there are altogether, we need to figure out how many sections of clay that she can make out of those 9 sticks. So we take the 9 sticks and we divide it by the portion that each child gets, which is 2/3. So we keep the first number the same, change division multiplication, and we use our reciprocal. 9 times 3 is 27. 1 times 2 is 2. 27 over 2 simplifies down to 13 and a half. Now the question says, how many children are there altogether? Well, 13 and a half doesn't make sense in this situation because we cannot have half a child. So we have to decide, are we going to round up or round down? Well, in this situation, we would round down to 13 because we do not have enough clay for the 14th child. We only have enough for 13 and a half portions of the clay. So for part B, what fraction of a stick of clay is left? Well, each child gets 2/3 of a stick. And we have enough clay for 13 and a half children, which means we have half of a portion. So we take 2/3 times 1/2. The 2's would cancel each other out, and we're left with 1/3 of a stick. Okay, I need to scroll down here a little bit to get to part C. We can still see most of our work there. Part C says, what is the total amount of modeling clay each child will get if the remainder, well, our remainder is our answer to part B, which is 1/3, is divided, so that tells us we're going to divide evenly. Now we're dividing it evenly. That means we're dividing it amongst the number of children we have. So it's going to be 1/3 divided by 13. Or in other words, our answer to B divided by our answer for A. So keep the first number the same, change division multiplication, use the reciprocal, second number. 1/3 times 1/13 is 1/39. And we're not done yet because we still haven't finished going through. So we've taken the remainder, we divided it evenly, and we're going to add it to the clay each child already has. Well, each child already has 2/3 of a stick. So we add the 1/39 to that. When adding fractions, we need a common denominator. Well, a good common denominator for 3 and 39 is 39. So to get from 3 to 39, we multiply by 13, which means we have to take 2 times 13. 2 times 13 is 26. 3 times 13 is 39. Plus 1/39 would give us 27/39, which simplifies down to 9/13. So each child could receive 9/13 of a stick. For our next problem here, we can use the previous one as an example of what to do. It's kind of a blueprint guide. So this time, instead of having 9 sticks of clay, we have 5 pumpkin pies that Meredith bakes. She cuts the pies into quarters and distributes the pieces equally among her neighbors. And each neighbor receives 3/4 of a pie as opposed to 2/3 of a stick. Well, for part A, we want to know how many neighbors does Meredith distribute the pies to. So again, we're assuming that she gives all the pies out, or as much out out as she can. And figuring out how many neighbors is very similar to figuring out how many children. So in the previous problem, we took the 9/6 of clay and divided it by 2/3. So in this situation, we're going to take the 5 pumpkin pies and divide it by 3/4. So we keep the first number, change division multiplication, use the reciprocal. 5 times 4 is 20. 1 times 3 is 3. 20 divided by 3 is 6 with 2/3. And we're in that same situation again. We cannot have 2/3 of a neighbor. So our answer is going to be 6 neighbors because we do not have enough pi for that 7th neighbor. So what fraction of a pie is left? Very similar to what fraction of a stick is left. Well, each neighbor gets 3/4 of a pie, and you have enough pie for 2/3 of a neighbor. 3's cancel out. Divide both 2 and 4 by 2. 4 becomes 2, 2 becomes 1. So we have half of a pie. And then I need to scroll down once again to answer part C. What is the total amount of pie each neighbor will receive if the remainder, so our remainder is 1/2, is divided evenly, means we're going to give it to all the neighbors. So that'd be 1/2 times 1/6, which is 1/12. And since the question asks what is the total amount each neighbor will receive, well, each neighbor already has 3/4, and they will now be receiving an additional 1/12. Well, a good common denominator to use when you have a 4 and a 12 is 12. So 9/12 is equivalent to 3/4. So you add that to 1/12, which gives you 10/12, which simplifies down to 5/6. So each neighbor would receive 5/6 of a pie. And for our final problem for today, we're going to have we have some bottles containing 2/5 gallon of water each, and they're used to fill a 7-gallon container. How many of these bottles are needed to fill the container with water to its brim? So what we're trying to do is trying to figure out how many 2/5 gallons there are in 7. So we're going to take those 7 gallons and we're going to break it down into 2/5 of a gallon. So it tells us to divide. So we keep the first number, change division, multiplication, use the reciprocal. 7 times 5 is 35. 1 times 2 is 2. 2 goes into 35 17 times, so we would have 17 and a half. Well, we are talking about bottles because there are some bottles that each contain, so we cannot have half a bottle. So in this situation, we would need to round up to 18 bottles. We're not going to make it 17 because 17 is not going to fill to the brim. You would still need half a bottle to get to the brim, and so that's why we would need to go to that 18th bottle. And so there's today's lesson. As always, I hope this helps.